You will start on the air now.
Starts me. Hello, good afternoon. I am Marta Betanzos, the ambassador to Spain and Portugal. I've been asked kindly by the chief of the Estoril Forum to introduce the debate, the issue of today. And in doing so, I have been given also the possibility to address some key issues that could help us to frame the topic. I have been given 10 minutes, which I will not exploit. I will just give the possibility to talk to those who are really the experts. And I just want to take a few seconds to welcome everybody. Charles Power, Real Instituto Elcano, Gabriel Calzada, Javier Fernández, Carlos Malabud, Ángel Rivero y Julio Crespo MacLegan. I guess that they need no introduction, and their profile will be already set, I think, close to the screen, so you can just go into that more thoroughly. As I said before, I am not an expert on the issue, but I have a few ideas that I would like to comment upon before giving the floor to the real experts. The first thought I had when I was asked to reflect upon the issue of how Iberoamerican countries have been reacting to the current pandemic crisis and what are the expectations in the coming future. Well, I was quite dubious about my capacity to answer this question, because the main thought I had that came to my mind is how can we talk about Ibero-American countries if us within Europe are still wondering what is coming next and how we better address our pandemic in our realm, let alone what can we say about other countries, other continents and regions. Of course, this issue is not taken by chance when talking about Ibero-American countries or Latin American countries. Naturally, being in Lisbon and being ambassador from Spain to Lisbon to Portugal means that we need to talk about what is the view of Spain and Portugal and in this crisis, and what is the role, if they have any, in helping Ibero-American countries to come out from the drawbacks of these pandemics. My view is that there are, of course, two relevant networks, institutions, international institutions, that even though multilateralism is being put into doubts, it's being criticized, it's being put into question, still multilateral institutions are relevant. And in this regard, Portugal and Spain, but mainly Latin American countries, have an extraordinary tool in their hands, which is the organizations that have been built or have been developed through the Ibero-American community, and why not also the Lusophonic community, the community of countries that have Lusophone, that are officially Portuguese speakers. Among La Comunidad Iberoamericana de Naciones and CPLP, I guess that in the future there's a great room for reflection and common thinking in order to make a breakthrough in what is coming in the coming future due to the pandemic. But that is just a hint. As maybe you already know, Spain has lately, in the last year, applied to become an observer in the CPLP. And in this regard, I am sure that making again this linkage between la Comunidad Iberoamericana de Naciones and CPLP through us, but not only through us, but also through other Latin American countries that also have joined the CPLP as observers, namely Chile, Uruguay, Argentina. I think there is a kind of room that we are able to exploit in the proper manner. But I would like to go to just leave this idea on the table. But I would like to go back to the difficulties in drawing a kind of scenario that could embrace what is holy, what embrace the Latin American countries' experience through the pandemic. To start with, there is very little, if any, possibility of drawing common reactions, common measures. On the contrary, we see that there are strong differences among all countries from all viewpoints, institutional viewpoints, from the economic sector, and also mainly through the political and governance institutions. We see that these differences apply also into the international fora. We have seen that through the regional integration, which is very weak, in fact, no partnerships, no common discussions have been brought up, or very few. And we see that from the demographic viewpoint, all societies have been hit, very rare exceptions. And within the society and the collectivities, those that have been more shaken are the weakest one. So in a whole, what has happened with the pandemic, also in Europe and other regions, has happened also in Latin American countries. The weakest have been more hit. And it remains to be seen whether the institutions have been able to counteract and to give extra support to these communities. As also has happened in Europe, the pandemic has also shown the weakest supports or pillars of these societies. The access to health and to social support has been very weakened or very, very rare. And in this regard, the possibility of increasing exclusion and social cliffs is becoming more acute. I don't want to exhaust all the issues. I would like just to pinpoint that as has happened in Europe, I believe that also in Latin America, the pandemic has raised the topic or the issue concerning whether the state needs to be strengthened, or whether the fragility of the institutions prove that communities and citizens should find alternatives to the state. And in this regard, I believe that as in Europe, also in Latin America, the pandemic, COVID, has not triggered, but has forced institutions and the thinking community and also politicians and scientists to dig into their experiences in order to find out what has not worked and why, which are the weaknesses that need to be addressed. Because all in all, what is probably being put at risk is not only the integration and the inclusion of all our societies, but namely the strength of our own democracy. Therefore, as I said before, as I promised, I was not going to exhaust my 10 minutes time, because I believe that you have, most of you, much more to say and in a much more wiser and clear manner than mine. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you again for Estoril Fora for allowing me to address this the issue, this debate today, and more particularly to the Instituto for Political Studies in La Universidad Nova. Now, further ado, I think it was the floor for, was it you, Gabriel? Or
yes.
Turn? Okay. Thank you again very much for listening to me, Gabriel. Now you have the floor.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Ambassador. It is really a pleasure to be once again at the Estoril Political Forum. So I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this Adolfo Suarez Memorial Debate on Iberoamerican perceptions of the future world order, organized in association with the Real Instituto Elcano de Madrid. And it would be even better if we would be there at the marvelous Palacio de Estoril and with all our friends having time to discuss and have debate not only in the panels but also in the gardens of the hotel. But I think Joao and his team has demonstrated once again that they can, when they face big challenges, they can come up with great solutions. This year, of course, I think all the topics are going to be more or less around and have been more or less around the COVID situation. And so it probably will be same with our panel. I think from my perspective, being in Guatemala and looking at what has been happening in Central America and in Latin American countries, I see that the reaction has been very, very diverse in Latin American countries. And probably it has something to do with the group of countries that have been influencing Latin America toward the socialism of the 21st century, while other countries has been dedicating the last decade to construct institutionally, to build on rule of law and develop institutions. And perhaps this is something to do with a very different reaction we have seen, perhaps not. But it's quite clear that some countries have managed the pandemic in a very top-down approach. And I believe that those countries have been suffering quite a lot. And I would expect that they will suffer for many more months to come, while other countries have taken a more general approach of some general measures and have given this civil society the responsibility to find out the very specific solutions to the very diverse problems that the pandemic has posed. I would think that if we look at what has been happening in Latin America, you see some countries where universities, private and public universities, has been offering a wide array of solutions to continue trade, to continue school, to continue with the work of the non-profit organizations. And you see a lot of solidarity. You see, I have been really astonished by the huge amount of solidarity that we have seen in civil society, especially in Central America, but all over Latin America. If we go back to the 1918 influenza, and we see the story of those 30 years that it took to overcome the virus, or to win the virus, I think we can also see that in the past, it has been mainly through the bottom-up approach that the pandemics has been overcome. So I'm very optimistic about the group of countries in Latin America that have taken that very general approach, leaving in the hands of the civil society the very specific solutions. And we see a lot of collaboration in that sense between corporations, universities, and small entrepreneurs that have been creating solutions continuously during those months. So I will leave it there and introduce two of our panelists. Ángel Rivero from Fundación Conversación in Madrid is professor of the Department of Politics and International Relations of the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. And he has an I would say astonishing work, the tradition of liberty in the Atlantic world. And this is the title of one of his books, but the whole work of Ángel goes around this topic. And it's, when you look at the different books he has published, his work, it's quite remarkable. How the tradition of liberty in the Americas and in the Atlantic world has been studied, analyzed, and developed by him. Javier Fernández Laschetti, also one of our panelists, has a vast career in politics. He has been in different positions in politics. He was director of IES. He worked as deputy director of Jose Maria Aznar cabinet. He has been regional minister of immigration, regional minister of healthcare. For me, more important than all this, and he's currently the minister, the regional minister of finance of the Comunidad de Madrid. More important than that is that he was vice president of Universidad Francisco Marroquín for 4 years. And in my opinion, Javier Laschetti is probably today's most coherent Spanish example of a politician whose actions and ideas are deeply rooted in the tradition of liberty. So it's really an honor to have Javier here with us also today. Thank you very much. And I think I pass the mic to Charles.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabriel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm the director of the Elcano Royal Institute. Buenas tardes a todos desde Madrid. I'm just going to say three things very briefly about how we at the Elcano Royal Institute, which is Spain's leading international relations institute, perceive the impact of the pandemic at three levels: the global level, the European level, and the Spanish level. And I will then very quickly introduce Professor Carlos Malamud and Dr. Julio Crespo Maclen. So the big question that we're asking ourselves is, what will the long-term impact of this pandemic be? First of all, on the international system, on what we used to call, and I would still like to call, the liberal international order. I think there's a growing consensus among academics and think tankers in the sense that what we are seeing is not so much a game changer, not so much a before and after moment, but basically an intensification, an aggravation, if you like, of trends which already existed. In other words, history is accelerating, but it's not really changing course. And this is evident, I think, in two areas. First of all, the erosion of this liberal international order. I think it's quite clear now that, sadly, the pandemic is not going to lead to a strengthening of multilateral institutions, very necessary though they obviously are. And secondly, it's leading to an intensification, a heightening of the rivalry, the growing rivalry between the US and China. Okay, so these are trends which were already in place and which are intensifying as a result of the pandemic. As far as Europe is concerned, in March, when the pandemic struck Europe and one country after another went into lockdown, pundits and some think tankers basically described this as a make or break moment for Europe. I'm very skeptical whenever I hear anyone say this is a make or break moment, but because I always think I've been here before. You know, we were there in 2008 and we were there again with the refugee crisis in 2015. And this is not, in fact, a make or break moment for the European Union. But what I want to talk about is the impact it's had on the EU and on its member states. A very interesting poll was recently conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which revealed two things. First of all, that the prestige, the standing, the credibility, the reputation of the United States of America has taken a very big hit in European eyes, basically because of the Trump administration's response to the crisis. But equally interestingly, China's standing, reputation, and credibility in European eyes has also been undermined. So mask diplomacy, so-called mask diplomacy, was actually a failure. Now, as far as the EU itself is concerned, I fully recognize and acknowledge that the EU's initial reaction was underwhelming, and the EU rightly came in for a lot of criticism. We didn't even manage to invoke a solidarity clause. We actually have a solidarity clause in the treaties, which was designed precisely for man-made disasters or natural disasters, even such as this, and we simply didn't have the political wherewithal to implement this. Nevertheless, I think the crisis has paradoxically given the EU a renewed sense of purpose, and above all, this rather wishy-washy concept that we have been using for the last few years, strategic autonomy, finally now has some real meaning. Prior to the crisis, when we talked about strategic autonomy, we were mainly talking about common foreign and security and defense policy. Now we're basically talking about technological, industrial, digital, and cyber autonomy. Okay, so I think the most important positive impact of the crisis has been the idea that the EU must be able to stand on its own 2 feet, not just in defense and security affairs, but in a whole array of policy arenas, is now much more well accepted. Let me immediately, by the way, say that what I mentioned earlier about China and the US does not mean that we should be equidistant in the growing rivalry between China and the US. We will obviously always be much closer to the United States of America because our values and our interests are essentially identical to those of the US, whatever the Trump administration may have done during the last 4 years. But the question I really want to, or the point I really want to stress is that even if Biden wins the election, or assuming Biden wins the election in November, there is no going back to the comfort zone of the 1990s or the 2000s in terms of the transatlantic relationship. In other words, we have to move on and we have to build a new transatlantic relationship with the next US administration. And sometimes I advise politicians and decision makers to be careful what they wish for. What do I mean by this? Well, even assuming Biden wins, the next US administration may actually be much more demanding of Europe. In other words, we will be expected to take this strategic autonomy, which I prefer to call strategic responsibility, much more seriously. In other words, we will not only be expected to get serious about European defense, we will also be expected to be more serious and constructive about the European neighborhood, both the eastern and the southern neighborhoods. So let me turn finally to Spain. Again, many pundits and observers immediately announced that this was a make or break moment for Spain. And it's true, as the ambassador mentioned, that Spain has been very badly hit. The Spanish economy is probably due to contract by 12% of GDP in the course of this year, which is a very significant impact. And there are serious and justified concerns about Spain's social resilience, the growth of inequality, and it's also proving a rather testing time for the Spanish political system, as we saw in Parliament over the last couple of days. Now, I want to be constructive and optimistic about this. At Elcano, we have been basically looking at how the next generation EU package and the EU's recovery plan can be used by Spain, making virtue out of necessity, and essentially putting these new European resources to work in order to modernize Spain in areas such as innovation, the green economy, the digital economy, and of course, to do this in a more inclusive manner. My final point is that there are serious concerns and questions about whether Spain will have the capacity, administrative and entrepreneurial and social ability to absorb these resources and to make the best of them. But I remain fundamentally bullish and optimistic about the future of Spain in this European and global, difficult European and global context. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Carlos Malamud, who is a professor of Latin American history at Spain's Open University, the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia, and he is also my colleague at Elcano, and he is the senior analyst for Latin America at the Institute. And we are also fortunate to have with us today Julio Crespo McLennan. I was his thesis director at Oxford, so I know him perhaps better than he would like me to know him. But what I want to stress today is that he's a wonderful historian and also currently the director of a new organization, the Hispanic Observatory. And I want to commend him for his bravery and civic courage in launching this new institution also in such difficult times. Thank you very much. So perhaps we should hand over to Angel.
Okay, thank you all. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Espada for inviting us to be in this wonderful Estoril Political Forum, even in this situation. The topic of this year's Estoril Political Forum is New Authoritarianism, Challenges to Liberal Democracy. And the Adolfo Suarez Memorial Lecture's goal is to make public Spanish and Latin American perceptions of on the future of the world. So in this spirit, I would like to state, seen from Spain, that the world, as Larry Diamond said, is under a democratic recession. Certainly, pandemia is a public health problem, but it's also a political, not challenge, but a threat. No? It is true that Spain is one of the most democratic countries in the world. It's 16 according to The Economist, last democracy index, and it's among the few countries that was called a full democracy according to this index. But the prospects of the future are dark. Democratic institutions are discredited. Political life is more polarized than ever. Political stability is weak, and economic and social forecasts are somber. Well, it goes very much against what Charles says, sorry. We were in the midst of a certain political crisis before the pandemic, and the COVID-19 triggered an unprecedented, it's going to trigger an unprecedented social and economic crisis coming very fast. As Isaiah Berlin said, liberal democracy is a fragile plant that needs very special preconditions to grow. And its diseases, nonetheless, are very old and well known by all of us. And one of these diseases is authoritarianism. That is the vision of politics that defends strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. This threat is well, it's very present today in all societies around the world, but I think it's also happening the same in Spain. Authoritarianism is always present in liberal democracies in a sort of marginal way. But what makes this disease dangerous, not only a threat, a challenge, but a threat, is that this unprecedented force of the COVID pandemic that is attacking all the countries of the world. The important thing, I think, to this new, so the novelty of the situation is in the pandemic, but the illness and diseases of democracy were already present in Spanish society. These diseases of liberal Spanish society were political corruption and lack of political and economic performance. And this was accompanied by anti-political ideologies that are already very present in Spanish political life, like populism and nationalism. We have secession nationalism, and also now there's a novelty anti-European political parties. Both nationalism defend secession from Spain, according to one of them, and others now are the anti-European, as I have already said. No? Under the banner of a real democracy, both populism and nationalism defend a model of democracy that is understood as the expression of a collective will embodied in a charismatic leader. They raised the flag of national sovereignty to defend secession from Spain, some and others secession from Europe. These authoritarian challenges to Spanish liberal democracy are as old as modern liberty, but the novelty of the situation is provided by an unprecedented disease, a pandemic, that is making life very difficult in all the world. The remedy, nonetheless, to this predicament is not new. It's as simple as to reinforce the democratic institutions and to defend individual liberty. Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. So the next speaker is Javier Fernandez Lasqueti.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Well, I'm very happy to participate once again in this great event of ideas and political discussion that is the Estoril Political Forum. Thank you, Dr. Calzada and Gabriel, for your very, very friendly introduction. And thanks to Professor Espada and team for having been able to overcome adversity and for calling us one more year under the portrait of Sir Winston Churchill. Well, I want to talk about Iberoamerica, Latin America, in times of coronavirus, about its economic consequences, about the poverty it is generating and how to overcome it, which in my opinion will be by making its economies more flexible. The coronavirus crisis has already claimed over 1 million deaths, but will also leave behind millions of impoverished people whose future will depend on the success or failure of governments to deal with the pandemic and its disastrous consequences. The pandemic has forced many countries to adopt measures that until recently were unthinkable in free democracies, such as the imposition of lockouts, curfews, and so on. The Swedish writer Johan Norberg has said, and I think it's brilliant, it's a quote, we have just seen a real-life preview of a deglobalized, closed world. We have no travel, no mobility, no trade, no offshoring, no capitalist exploitation. We have shut down the world for just 2 months, and the result is already in global depression, mass unemployment, poverty, and hunger. It's really a preview of a horror movie. That's the quotation of Johan Norberg. Actually, the global economy will fall by 4.4% in 2020, according to the latest forecast by the International Monetary Fund, the biggest drop since the Great Depression. Latin America will be one of the hardest hit areas. Indeed, it will suffer the worst recession in the world with a contraction of 8.1%, twice the global average. The countries most affected, excluding Venezuela, will be Peru, Argentina, and Ecuador, with falls of over 10%, while major players such as Mexico and Brazil will fall by 9% and 6% respectively. The reasons for this slump are diverse, ranging from lack of foresight and deficient health systems to the structural weaknesses of their economies, which are highly dependent on tourism and the export of raw materials, two of the sectors worst hit by the coronavirus crisis. Furthermore, it's very difficult to guarantee the confinement of those infected and their closest contacts when a significant part of the population depends on informal economy, really strict economy, for survival. So far, we have suffered the economic and social consequences of the pandemic, But it is time also for solutions. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last time that humanity has faced similar tragedies. And history has shown us time and again the way forward. Anything that moves forward on the path of freedom and the free market will bring wealth and development to society as a whole. Anything that means going down the road of political servitude and economic interventionism is a guarantee of poverty and decline. There are thus two paths to choose from, freedom or statism. Iberoamerica has traditionally opted for the latter, and the results of this choice are obvious. Many of the countries belonging to this region are far behind in the index of economic freedom of the World's Bank and the World's Bank Doing Business Index. The coronavirus crisis calls for doing things differently because the world is now different. Companies and entrepreneurs need as much flexibility as possible to adapt to the changing circumstances imposed by the pandemic. The coronavirus has dealt a double blow to the activity of many businesses. Fear of contagion is changing social habits and therefore demand, while government restrictions and quarantines are resulting in businesses closures and bankruptcies. Many entrepreneurs and professionals can no longer do things the same way. These are times when creativity and innovation take on a special role. The problem, however, is that existing regulation does not allow them always to explore and adapt. We will not get ahead with more obstacles, more taxes, and more debt. We need less regulation and therefore more flexibility, both to overcome the difficulties of today and to discover new ideas capable of generating growth and jobs again tomorrow. The countries that understand this diagnosis correctly will come out of the crisis sooner and better. A group of young and brilliant Australian professors argues this very well in a small book that I strongly recommend reading during the confinement, entitled Unfreeze: How to Create a High Growth Economy After the Pandemic. Regulation is always old knowledge. It always lies behind innovation. The digital revolution has been going on for years, but the pandemic is accelerating it. Supply and demand are still there. What has changed is the context, the way in which they relate to each other. The challenge for the entrepreneurs is to discover these new channels. Governments that persist in maintaining outdated regulations that prevent the development of new business ideas will retard their exit from the crisis. And unfortunately, the majority of Latin American countries are a traditional example of this mistaken strategy, including Spain. Spain ranks 97th in the world in terms of ease of opening a business, which is not surprising considering that the governments publish 1 million pages of regulation every year. Although within Spain, there are also exceptions. The region of Madrid is the freest region with the lowest taxes in the country, and thanks to these policies, it is also the richest region. So, in my opinion, less government gazette and more economic freedom. This is the strategy for returning to growth, creating jobs, and generating the funds needed to finance healthcare, education, and social services in a sound and sustainable manner. No need to ask for permission to innovate. This is the concept that I like very much of permissionless innovation, coined at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Finishing, the free market economy based on freedom, private property, competition, and the rule of law has achieved the greatest progress of humanity in the last 2 centuries, despite wars, crises, pandemics, and depressions, as Steven Pinker, Matt Ridley, or Johan Narbeck, among others, have shown. And the good thing is that it will continue to do so in the future, despite the coronavirus, as long as governments do not prevent it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in Estoril, and I also would like to thank Joao Espada for his kind invitation. Talking about Iberoamerica implies talking about two very different worlds, each of them with enormous internal differences. On the one hand, Latin America. On the other, the Iberian Peninsula, which means Spain, Portugal, plus Andorra, given the latter's recent incorporation to the Iberoamerica General Secretariat or SEGIP. It is true that Spain, essentially in Spain, many use the word Iberoamerica as a synonym for Latin America, since they consider it to be a shameful loan from France, even an imposition. Personally, I prefer to call Latin America by this name and to use Iberoamerica to refer to this complex, but at the same time, enriching set of countries, societies, languages, and peoples that make up the universe of those who speak in Portuguese and Spanish. The first question to ask is if there is something that can be defined as Ibero-American perceptions, or if there is an Ibero-American vision of the world. It is difficult for something like that to exist, to begin with, due to the differences between Europe and Latin America. Further, because there are so many other differences both between Latin America itself, but also between Spain and Portugal. All of this makes it difficult to share perceptions about the international agenda, and in particular about the future world order. Spain and Portugal belong to the European Union, a regional integration process that, despite its many difficulties, continues to make progress. In Latin America, regional integration is undergoing a deep crisis. Almost all of the integration institutions that emerged in the first decade of the 21st century under the protection of the Bolivarian umbrella are practically paralyzed. The most serious point and a good proof of this deterioration process is that during the most critical months of the pandemic, there has been practically no coordinated intergovernmental action, either to minimize its impact or to improve the level of response. In general terms, the policy has been every man for himself, or sauve-qui-peut, and all governments have acted of their own accord and is their own interest. To this, we should add the presence of the so-called COVID populism, a select group with no political or ideological borders. Among them, in a strange coexistence, we got characters as ideologically opposed as Brazil's Bolsonaro and Mexico's López Obrador, both with a clear denialist or reductionist attitude towards the pandemic. There also include the Bolivarians Nicolás Maduro and Daniel Ortega, but El Salvador's right-leaning Nayib Bukele as well. On this point, Latin America has the privilege of having set an international trend. Populism, a phenomenon created in the continent, just remember Juan Domingo Perón, is now a worldwide trend, from Berlusconi to Duterte and from Putin to Trump. Today, Latin America is characterized by a high level of fragmentation, a process that began in the first decade of the 21st century, but also by its diversity and high level of uncertainty. Its diversity is the product of the last great electoral cycle from 2017 to 2019, which did not give rise to the expected shift to the right. On the contrary, in the elections, there has been a relative balance between governments of the left and center left and those of the right and center right. The result of the Bolivian elections may alter this situation. For its part, the uncertainty has been largely generated by the intense and violent mobilizations of the second half of the 2019. These three factors, especially fragmentation and diversity, have made it impossible to reach a minimum consensus on either the regional or the international agendas. As for the regional agenda, we have recently seen how the president of the Inter-American Development Bank was elected. The election of Trump's candidate, breaking one of the bank's unwritten rules, has shown the inability of Latin American governments to reach a common position and choose a powerful consensus candidate and ensuring a different outcome. What's more, The Venezuela crisis has become an element of tension that complicates both relations within Latin America and those of Latin America with the rest of the world. Emilio Lamo de Espinosa, chairman of the Cano Royal Institute, often says that in international issues, Latin America is neither present nor expected. This forum statement is related to the peculiar way that Latin America has of finding its place in the world. Few countries saw globalization more as an opportunity than a threat. Chile and Colombia among them. Experiences like that of the Pacific Alliance are rare. And although the period of autarky is over, statism and protectionism are still present in the region. In other words, Latin America is only interested in those issues on the international agenda that directly affect it. If they do not, it's better to look the other way or show a neutrality that ultimately ends up being misunderstood. Another important example is Latin America's secondary role in the G20. It should be known that Latin America is overrepresented due to the presence of Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And yet the level of activity has been minimal. Not only that, but coordination between the three countries among themselves and with the rest of Latin America is practically non-existent. The post-pandemic world will be marked by the growing confrontation between the US and China, and confrontation that goes far beyond the trade war and increasingly open and widespread. In Latin America, the government of Jair Bolsonaro, Trump's main regional ally, is evaluating banning Huawei from participating in the development of 5G in the country. What we are seeing in a process that should intensify over the coming years is a growing pressure from both Washington and Beijing so that their business partners, friends, and allies end up choosing in favor of one and against the other. In the EU, despite the difficulties and the difference between member countries, has managed to develop a doctrine of strategic autonomy. We might legitimately ask if Latin America will be in a position to do something similar. And here the answer can be no other than no, at least for now. As I have already said, it is impossible to reach the necessary consensus on any issue of the international agenda, and this is one of them. At this point, it is impossible to find common positions. This weakens Latin America countries and leaves them at the mercy of the two great powers. It should not be forgotten that, on the one hand, the US continues to be the international actor with the greatest preeminence in the region. Therefore, its capacity for exerting pressure remains high. On the other hand, China has become, in a very short time, the leading or second largest trading partner for most Latin American countries. Its investments are growing and it has public funds to build infrastructures that Western governments lack. At the same time, the use of the Belt and Road Initiative has allowed it to have an ever greater regional presence. Here an important question arises. Will Latin American countries be able to do without the China market and China investments? Again, the answer is no, and this will condition the decisions. The question which was not rhetorical was, do you want to exchange the Chinese market for the US? However, there is an important issue here in view of the drift that COVID-19 has imposed on international relations. Will there or will there not be a self-imposed withdrawal by China in the current circumstances? And how will this affect the relationship between the US and the presence in Latin America? One final note. In recent months, the president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, has repeatedly said that the virus has destroyed capitalism. Beyond the mistaken forecast, his statement corroborates how isolated some governments are from international questions and how little they think about essential issues for post-COVID reconstruction, such as the Green Pact, the commitment to renewable energy, the fight against climate change, and the need for and the need to closely link to the digital revolution. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Now, Julio, it's your turn.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here in Estoril, even though in this virtual version, but nevertheless, it's great to see you all, and obviously hope that in the near future, we will be able to get together again in this wonderful palace in Estoril. Now, when I was invited to join this prestigious forum, I decided I would like more to address the general issue of the conference of the extent to which authoritarianism is challenging liberal democracy, and the Iberoamerican perception of this, rather than the answers to COVID-19. I'm not an expert in that topic, and I don't find that I can contribute to the very difficult question of whether the Ibero-American world will do better at coping with the COVID-19 itself than other parts of the world. But I think this is a very important moment to reflect on how the Ibero-American community is, what the role of this Ibero-American community is within this world order. First of all, I'd like to take a historical perspective and reflect on this, how this Ibero-American community has evolved over the last decades. We can say that there was a golden period of the Ibero-American community from the 1990s to the early years of the 21st century, when the global crisis began. And it's really then that we see an emergence, of a genuine emergence of Ibero-America in the strict sense of the word. This coincides with a period when the Ibero-American summits began, an annual summit that contributes in a very substantial way to the emergence of this Ibero-American community that goes beyond the celebration of cultural and historical ties. And it's been strengthening its cohesion by economic integration, political cooperation, and cooperation on foreign policies. And of course, all this was taking place against a background of economic growth generally and expanding democracy. This is very important, of course. Those were the years when they were living under the effects of the third wave of democracy that began in Portugal, followed by Spain, and with important transitions in Latin America being so successful that there was a time when Cuba remained the only non-democratic country in Latin America. And this allowed to definitely dispel the myth that Iberoamerica was incapable of consolidating democracies. Now, then we have there was a vision which emerged at that time of Iberoamerican as a group of nations based on two of them world's cultural communities, the Spanish-speaking and the Portuguese-speaking, reconciled by a common history rather than confronted by it, with solid democracies and increasingly prosperous countries. And this became a solid bastion of the Atlantic and the Western world in the post-Cold War era, where liberal democracy, at that time, liberal democracy was very much at the heart of this community. But of course, now that you see it from this perspective, this seems like a bygone age, and things have changed quite dramatically. This golden era collapses from the second decade of the 21st century, quite dramatically, under the effects of the global economic crisis, leading to great polarization within the Ibero-American community. Before that, of course, we have to take into account how the rise of Hugo Chavez and the spread of Chavism and the so-called socialism of the 21st century deeply divided and confronted the Latin American world. And this had deep consequences. From then, we've seen how liberal democracy has been undermined in a very substantial way in several countries. And of course, this division continues. this also constituted the end to very important processes of economic integration, like Mercosur. Chavez has been very much like a cancer in Latin America. It has ruined Venezuela, one of the wealthiest nations in America, and it's also led to a deep confrontation within Latin America and the whole Iberoamerican world. Now, having said this, if we reflect on the state of democracy in the Iberoamerican world, at present, we still have reasons for optimism. After all, if we have a look at the quality of democracy in Iberoamerica, it's relatively good if we situate it in global perspective. According to Freedom House's most recent report, out of 22 members, 12 were considered free, 7 semi-free, and 3 of them not free: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Of course, this is a decreasing tendency if we look at it from a historical perspective, but it's not so bad, again, I repeat, if we look at it in global perspective. Now, very quickly, I don't have much time, so I'll just have to reflect, just dedicate the last 3 minutes on the situation of Spain. Spain's situation is quite worrying if we consider that it was one of the countries with highest level of democracy in the world. And nevertheless, we've seen how the model of that Spain offered has deteriorated in a very substantial way. We've had, if we look at this in certain historical perspective, we see that, first of all, there's been a crisis of political institutions triggered by economic crisis, a collapse of the two-party system, and a rise of successionism. And of course, the last 6 years have been tremendously unstable if we take into account that there's been as many as 4 general elections putting an end to the remarkable stability that Spain enjoyed historically. So, of course, Spain's situation is different to that of Latin America. Certainly, we cannot say that there's an authoritarian challenge as there is in several countries in Latin America, but we see a deterioration of the model of liberal democracy, and of course, the threat of this model of liberal democracy declining into electoral democracies, or even what is worse, an ochlocracy. This is the situation. So to conclude, the Ibero-American world is unfortunately deeply divided at present, and there is not much hope for a coordinated response and strategy towards, in order to contribute to the Atlantic community of nations, let alone to the international liberal order. But of course, in the same way that after the Black Death, we had the Renaissance, then perhaps this pandemic might bring unexpected, very good news for the Ibero-American community. So I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julio. Unfortunately, I have been told that we don't have time for Q&As. However, we do have a message from Professor Espada that I have been asked to read, and I have some very interesting information, very important information. Professor Espada says, I'm quoting, of course, I would like to thank you emphatically for this excellent Adolfo Suarez memorial debate. And indeed, I think the talks by Angel, Javier, Carlos, and Julio has been extraordinary. This is me, and not Joao, and I'm sure Joao would say the same. I continue with Joao. I now have the privilege and the pleasure of inviting you to the next year's 29th edition of the Estoril Political Forum. The Estoril Palace Hotel is already fully reserved for June 28th, 29th, and 30th. We all look forward to hosting you in person at the charming Estoril Palace. Please save the dates. So see you there, hopefully.
Fantastic. We'll
Thank you.
definitely be there.
Excellent.
All the-
Bye-bye.
our agendas.
Looking
Bye-bye.
forward to it.
Bye.
Gracias a todos.
Adiós a todos.
Thank you all.